categories of mitzvahs in the Torah. So the one called Mishpatim deals with laws that are very rational, that make perfect sense, that make society a livable society, a humane society, and they are laws like don't steal, don't murder, ones that the rest of the world would actually have embraced, even if it were not for these laws in the Torah. So now there's several things we're going to delve into with regards to this parsha, and hopefully we can draw out some lessons. We're going to look first of all at what laws are spoken about, specifically in the beginning of the parsha. It's very interesting. We are dealing with, right in the beginning, coming straight after Matan Torah, straight after the receiving of the Torah on Har Sinai, which was in last week's parsha, Parshas Yisro, or Yisro. We are now dealing with the laws of slaves. So what's given to us straight away is something that we could question. Why is it that straight after having received the Torah, the first thing that's spoken about is slavery, or as many people prefer to refer to it as an indentured servant? Because once we understand the laws of what we might call slavery in the Torah, we're going to understand that it's not slavery as has historically been experienced by mankind through the ages. Slavery has been a shocking, how shall we say, denial of human dignity, where one person enforces their rule over another against another person's will. And slavery has been something which has completely denied any humanity of another person, any dignity. It has been an experience of oppression, of torture, of terror. That's not the slavery that is referred to in the Torah. So it's important to become educated, because as soon as somebody hears about this term slavery and how it's something that's spoken about in the Torah, not only that, but there are laws surrounding this issue or this situation of a person being a slave of another, then immediately what's conjured up is all the negativity that's associated with the idea of slavery. However, let's ask several questions. Let's delve into the text. The first thing is that before we start to embark on understanding the Torah's take on slavery, let's have a look at the very first pasuk, the very first line, or the very first verse that this week's Parsha Mishpatim begins with. And it says like this, Ve'elu ha-mishpatim asher tasim lifnehem, which means, and these are the laws that you should set before them. And obviously, Chazal, our sages, want to understand every single word in the Torah. No, they want to understand more than that, every letter, every dot, because everything has got so many layers of meaning, and we can draw insights from every single thing in the Torah. And so what's highlighted by Chazal, by our sages, is this word lifnehem, which means before them. And we can read it out on three levels, which we learn out from Likutei Sichos by the Rebbe. So Chassidus brings a light and shines it on this word and tells us that with regard to this word lifnehem, we can learn several lessons. The first is that if lifnehem literally means before them, what we are being told on a slightly deeper level by the Torah is that when you have an issue of law and there is a situation of conflict or a situation where you need judges to come and judge a case, if you are a Jew, then it should be put before them. Who does that mean? Who's it referring to? It's referring to a Jewish court of law. It's referring to the Beis Din, because with regards to the laws that are dealt with in this week's Parsha, Parshas Mishpatim, they are laws that even a civil court or a court of the land will be able to deal with. Nevertheless, we as Jews are commanded that we should set it before them. That means before the Beis Din, before a Jewish court of law. And that has to be our first point of departure. That has to be our first choice in terms of having judges adjudicate or judge a situation that we find ourselves in. So that's the first thing. To look at it slightly deeper, the word lifnehem is connected with panim, which we can read out as face, but it also comes from the word pnimios. Now, pnimios means inner and inwardness. And this refers to two things. The one is the inner dimension of the Torah, the more mystical dimension of the Torah, which we cannot learn on the level of pshat, which is just like the simple meaning of the text. So when we are told that these laws should be taken also according to the pnimius of the Torah, means that we have an obligation to go and learn the deeper dimension that's associated with these laws. It's not positive to experience the Torah as a dry canon, as something that we're obligated in, and therefore we're simply going to practice. It just becomes ritual in that way, and it lacks passion, it lacks fire, and therefore it can also become unsustainable, which is a danger. So we're understanding that even with these rational laws, we must go and delve into their deeper meaning. And I'm going to bring an example of that later on, where we look at one of the laws in Parshas Mishpatim, and there's a very beautiful insight by the Baal Shem Tov, understanding it on a soul level. Okay, and finally, the Alter Rebbe brings, with regards to Lifnehem, and reading it out on the level of pnimius, of inwardness, that we also have to try and touch the inner essence of the student when learning out these laws or teaching these laws. The objective should also be that we have to reach the depth within the person in order to open their hearts. So that's a beautiful way to begin as a preface to understanding more in this week's Parsha. So now let's get to the laws of slaves. One of the questions that was asked, and I read a very beautiful article by a Rabbi Menachem Feldman that he wrote commenting on this week's Parsha. And one of the questions that is asked is, why is it that the very beginning of this Parsha deals with slavery and the laws of slaves? And he comments how many rabbis who would like to make the Torah appear more palatable and more beautiful, and something that people resonate with. Many of those rabbis would prefer to be kind of sandwiched deeper in the Parsha and hidden away amongst other things. But here it is right as you open up this week's Parsha, and therefore it's glaring at us. And the question is why? Why straight after we've received the Torah on Har Sinai is the first thing that's highlighted is the laws of slaves. So the answer that was brought out by this rabbi was a very beautiful insight. And he says like this, he says, well, we get the Torah, and if we're talking about laws, we're talking about bringing justice to the people. We're talking about making sure that everybody gets treated in a fair way. And so what's brought out with regards to the laws of the slaves is that a slave or a person who becomes a slave to a master, a Hebrew slave, has to be freed after the 6th year of servitude. A person in the 7th year can no longer be kept as a slave. So first of all, that shows us that straight away even people who have this lowest of statuses in our society and in the community, we are already dealing with the justice that has to be given to them. We are already making sure that they are dealt with in a fair way. Let's just go back a little bit and understand, how does a person become a slave? Is it that people go to the marketplace, purchase somebody who was taken, or like Yosef, who was taken by people, who was sold in the most unjust of ways against his will? Is that the way slavery works in the Torah? And the answer is no. So a Hebrew slave gets this status and becomes somebody who's in servitude to a master for one of two reasons. One is that he would have stolen, he would have enacted an act of theft, and is unable to recompense the person from whom he stole. And therefore, the judges would sell him as a slave, and through those years of servitude, he would make up and be able to recompense the master. And usually, that person is sold as a slave to the person from whom he stole. That's the one situation. The other situation is, very interestingly, if a person found themselves in a state of incredible poverty, and they've sold their fields, and they've sold their belongings, and they've sold their home, and they still are not able to meet their debts, or they are unable to live in a dignified way, then they could voluntarily actually sell themselves as a slave, which is very interesting. So they could sell themselves as a slave in order to be able to have some livelihood and to be looked after. And but in both those situations, the term of slavery cannot go beyond 6 years. So that only applies, by the way, to a Hebrew male slave. What about a female? Well, if a family found themselves in a very difficult situation, that they were indigent and there's absolutely no way for the family to survive, then the father had the permission, according to the Torah, to sell, and I'm sure this is not going to sound very palatable, to sell his young daughter under the age of 12 as like a maid to another Jewish family, which meant that the way that she would serve, or her servitude, would be more like a maid. She would work in the house of the master, but the only way that the father was permitted to sell her was if there was an opportunity for her to marry into that family. So either the master is young, and at some time in the future he can marry this young girl, or the master has a son with whom this child can eventually marry. So the objective of selling a girl into servitude is always marriage. If that's not an opportunity, then she's not to be sold to this family. Also, let's say she reaches a stage where her body reaches a stage of puberty, and she starts to show signs of physical maturity. At that stage, she has to be redeemed, which means she cannot not work for this family anymore. Or if 6 years pass and the master or their son doesn't desire to marry her, they have no wish to marry her, then at that stage she has to be redeemed. So these are all some of the understandings of the laws of slavery. But now let's look a little bit into the conditions of the life of a person who is called an Eved in the Torah. Okay? So an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, when somebody acquired a slave, the Torah says really that person acquired a master. Because the Torah is very specific, and I was reading about it in the Midrash in order to get more insights. And the Torah is very, very specific about how a Hebrew slave has to be treated. It's forbidden to give them very lowly jobs that are beneath their status, like cleaning his master's shoes, Whatever the master eats and drinks, the slave has to eat the same. In other words, if the master has fine wine to drink at his meals, then the slave, we're not permitted to give the slave water. The slave has to have the same fine wine. If the master eats nice foods, the slave has to also have an equal status of the type of food that he eats. If the master sleeps on a bed, it is forbidden to let the slave sleep on straw. If in the home there is one pillow, then the slave gets the pillow. The master has to forfeit it. So you see, there's such a beautiful wisdom here, number one. Number two is we've seen that if a person ended up being a slave because of poverty or because of they have committed a crime, then straight away, first thing in this parsha that's dealing with laws, we deal with the laws that make sure that those who are at the bottom of the rung of society, somebody who is a criminal and somebody who is very poor, that we make sure that they are treated justly in terms of everything that we've just enumerated, as well as in terms of stating unequivocally right at the beginning that they may not be kept as a slave for more than 6 years. Whereas if you see in common society today, and I'm talking even about a society that does practice justice, a democratically run land, nevertheless, if you actually look at it, it is those who are very wealthy who normally can tap into the court system and be able to get justice. Because it costs a fortune to hire an attorney. It costs even more to hire an advocate. If a person needs to escalate their case to a higher court until it goes to an appeal court and a Supreme Court, many people or most people do not have that kind of ability financially. And yes, there are certain societies, there's a law society at Wits, etc. But here, you're talking about those who are at the bottom of the rung of the ladder in society. And straight away, the Torah is saying, we're going to make sure that they're treated in a good way. Further, we see that the Torah does not believe in incarceration, in imprisonment at all. It's not something that is put into our books of law. That's not the way to rehabilitate somebody. If somebody's been a thief and then you're putting them into a family where they are going to be treated in a dignified way, they're also going to be given an opportunity to learn from the family, specifically if this family is a Torah observant family and they're treating their slaves according to the commandments of the Torah. So we see there's such a wisdom here. And if somebody is very poor, well, rather than that they should be on the streets, they have the ability to become a part of a family where they're going to be treated properly, where they're going to get food of a high standard, where they're going to get room and board, and where they are not given like a term for life, where if they become a slave, now they are enslaved for life, and they're not able to go to the next level of becoming freed or of being able then to stand on their own 2 feet and get out of this situation of servitude. It's only a 6-year term. It may not continue before that. Having said that, sometimes a person would say, I love my master and I do not want to go free. 6 years have passed. I'm in the 7th year, but I want to live here. I'm being well treated. I don't believe I have any other opportunity in the world out there. And further, if a person is married when they are become enslaved, so to speak, or go into this position of servitude, then their wife and children also have to be looked after by the master. So if a person says, I like the way that I'm living, I don't choose freedom after 6 years, What does the Torah say then? Then it says, that person's master shall bring him to the judges of the court who at first sold him into slavery, and he must stand, the slave has to stand near the door, by the doorpost, and his master has to take an awl, which is like a pointed tool, and pierce his right ear. What's the purpose of that? Not to say, okay, this guy is tagged, and from now on you can all see his tag, he belongs to me. There's a much deeper reasoning to that, and it is as follows, that this person, we are told, first of all, is part of the Jewish nation, and they heard several things at Matan Torah. We are told that all of Bnei Israel, including the souls of all future generations, were there at Matan Torah. We all heard the Aseret HaDibros, the 10 Commandments. We all experienced revealed godliness. And so this person heard, thou shalt not steal. And yet, they did not keep that commandment. And this person further has heard that we are not supposed to be slaves to Paro anymore. God took us out of that slavery so that we should become servants to him, so that we are free to serve the Almighty, which ultimately brings us the greatest freedom. That is our passport to the greatest freedom. So this person is choosing to go against that. This person is saying, although I've heard what I've heard, nevertheless, I'm choosing to remain in servitude to another, which means that I cannot be completely a servant of God. And therefore, his ear has to be pierced in this way. Just to bring another insight that the Rebbe brings, that my husband shared with me, from a sikha from the Rebbe. Last week's Parsha, where it was Matan Torah, we are told that Bnei Israel saw that which is normally heard, and they heard that which one would normally see. And it seems like, what is this mixing up of the different senses? So a beautiful way to explain it is that if godliness was revealed, it was complete revelation of godliness at that time, then what we normally do in experiencing spirituality is normally it's something that we hear and we understand intellectually. And when we experience physicality, the materialism of this world, that's something we see. It's so much more real for us. But at the time of Matan Torah, because it was such a revelation of godliness and the spiritual world became so real, they experienced it in the way of seeing, the same way we see physicality. And the materialism, the physicality of this world became less pronounced, and they experienced it in the way of hearing. And so the Rebbe says, well then, why is this indentured servant, this person who wants to remain in servitude to his master forever, why is his ear being pierced? Because then he experienced Matan Torah in terms of seeing. So why isn't something done to his eye? Where he got the Aseret HaDibros, he heard the 10 Commandments in the way of seeing. What has got to do with his ear? Why is his ear being pierced? And the Rebbe says, because afterwards, one has to live according to the commandments of the Torah. And the commandments of the Torah, then, we learn and understand. Again, on the level of living in the mundane world. Back to taking the teachings of the Torah and infusing this mundane world with spirituality, with godliness. And so that's why at a later stage, he is again hearing what the Torah says, do not steal, etc. And you need to be a free person to serve me, says Hashem. And therefore, that's why his ear is pierced. So that's just understanding it on a bit of a deeper level. Okay, so I found something very beautiful that Hasidus brings out from the Zohar from the book of Kabbalah to explain to us and to give us an insight into what is this, these laws of the sale and slavery of a Jew in terms of our own personal avodah, our own personal service to God. And the Kabbalah or the Zohar tells us that the idea of slaves is symbolic of the descent of the soul into the body to live a lifetime and to live according to our mission in this world. So there are three categories of slaves that are brought in this example. The one is the Canaanite slave. The other one is the Eved Ivri, or the Hebrew slave. And finally, the Hebrew maidservant. So the Canaanite slave is really the lowest status of slave. And I don't think it's dealt with in this week's parsha. It's probably dealt with in another parsha. But this really refers to the initial stages of man's divine service, where a person still lusts after all the worldly physicality, worldly pleasures, and nevertheless has still taken on Kabbalah's ol, the yoke of heaven, and is starting to have an appreciation of godliness, but they still have this nefesh habahamis, this animal soul that is very, very much attracted to worldly pleasures. And their service is really one of fear and of conforming to Hashem on a level of a servant. Okay, then we have the Eved Ivri, the Hebrew slave, and that is already a higher level, whereby a person has been able to, the divinity of their godly soul has begun to illuminate their animal soul, actually. And they start to feel more of a desire for godliness. Nevertheless, there still is, or that desire for materialism and for physical pleasures has not been completely quieted. It hasn't been completely subdued. And then we get the third level. And the highest level, ladies, let's take note, is that symbolized by the Hebrew maidservant. Why? Because as we've understood, in our journey in this lifetime, our soul's journey in this lifetime is one where our mission is to desire God, so that ultimately our desires for worldly pleasures become completely quietened, and our desire is for Hashem. And ultimately, the Hebrew maidservant, the objective of selling her into slavery is for unity, for the purposes of marriage. If there is not that opportunity, she may not actually be sold to this family. And therefore, our goal in this journey of life is that we should also desire that complete oneness, that complete unity with Hashem. And that has to be our constant striving in this lifetime. Okay, so as I said earlier in our shiur, we're going now to move to another law in this week's parsha, in Mishpatim. And we can then bring out a little bit of this idea of worldly pleasures that we're talking about. Because yes, we need to cultivate within ourselves, and it's a struggle, it's a constant struggle. I don't know, other than for tzaddikim, if it's something that we ultimately actually master. But our desire needs to be for God, for connection with Hashem, for a desire to serve Hashem, because we are feeling such an inner fire, an inner desire, as well as an awe, as well as a yira, understanding that there is no master in this entire universe other than the Almighty. But Let's look at another law in this week's parsha that it can give us an insight so that we shouldn't go to an extreme of thinking that means let us crush our body and let us crush all our needs for physicality. So it says in this week's parsha, when we're talking about the laws of negligence and theft, it says, this is under the laws of judicial law and avoiding prejudice. It says, perhaps if you see your enemy's donkey lying under its load, you would want to refrain from helping him. However, you must help him. Okay? So what's it telling us? It's telling us that though there are those out there who you feel may mistreat you, who are your enemies, nevertheless, you should not mistreat them back. Not them, nor even their animals. So that makes sense on the level of pshat. And certainly I think we can learn out from this that when a person feels that they've been mistreated, something that we constantly have to bring back into our consciousness and meditate on. But when we feel that we've been mistreated, we should respond to a wrong with a right. We should nevertheless not go back and mistreat somebody as an act of revenge. And in fact, I always try and remember myself and try to teach my children when they're afraid someone's going to mistreat them or someone's been unfair, there's an injustice that has happened. You can imagine how much it appears to happen, specifically in the classroom at school. Try and always do what is right, because when we do what is right in Hashem's eyes, then ultimately He makes it right for us. And I think you can never go wrong with that philosophy. Now, the Baal Shem Tov brings this pasuk, this verse, and he gives us a very, very beautiful, deeper insight into it. And he says like this, he says as follows, that, and interestingly, this is amazingly interesting, today's Hayom Yom, which is Chof Ches Shvat, the 28th of Shvat, actually is dealing with this pasuk and this lesson from the Baal Shem Tov. So by divine providence, we're actually talking about it today, which is really special. I know that well because it's my oldest son Yitzi's birthday today. So, the Baal Shem Tov brings like this. If you see your enemy's donkey lying under its load, you would want to refrain from helping him. However, you must help him. The word for donkey is chamor. Chamor can also be written as chomer. It has the same root. Chomer means materialism. Chomer means materialism, so it refers to our animal soul, it refers to our body and the desires for physicality. So it says, why would it be considered an enemy? You're calling this chomer an enemy, or this donkey and the materialism, because our mission is the pursuit of godliness. And the truth is, the more that we focus on that, the Rebbe tells us, the more the clutter in our life will actually be removed, which means the problems, the financial issues, God forbid, the health issues, etc., the more that we focus on fulfilling our mission, the more God then removes the clutter so that we can continue on that healthy path. Okay, but to get back to this, why is it that we would consider this the enemy? Because we have a godly mission, and therefore our desire and our pursuits should be the Torah, the mitzvot, the desire to refine ourselves and to connect ever more to Hashem, and to bring out ever more our own godly light. So if we have our body and these physical desires, it's considered an enemy. It's contrast with the mission that we're supposed to be on. That's why we would consider it an enemy. And therefore, if we see that it's struggling under its load, what does that mean? It means that we are commanded with the Torah to learn Torah, to keep the mitzvot. and we're commanded to keep them with joy and vitality. And yet we may think the body is lazy and complacent and not wanting to keep the Torah and not wanting to fulfill the mitzvot. And so we might think to ourselves, well, then what must I do? I'm not going to help the body. I'm going to try crush it. I'm going to try and neglect it. I'm going to fast. I'm going to undertake all kinds of acts of deprivation. And therefore, I'm hoping to crush this body and all those physical desires so that it does not distract me from my mission anymore. And the Baal Shem Tov says, you must help him. Help him unload. Help that donkey. Help that chomer. Your body and the animal soul within you. That which desires physicality. The objective is don't crush it. It's not going to work. And in fact, in olden times, those who desired to be on a very high spiritual level would undertake all kinds of fasts, and they would really do all kinds of acts of self-deprivation. And the Baal Shem Tov brought that is going to make us very depressed. It doesn't assist us on our mission, number one. Number two, it weakens us physically. And we need the body. The body is the vehicle that kindly allows the soul to do its mission in this physical world. It's through the body that we can engage with this world and that we can actually allow the neshama, the soul, to go to a higher level. But not only that, the objective is that the body should be refined and elevated through the mitzvot. So we have to let the body be a partner. We must help it unload. We've got to support the body, and we've got to look after ourselves, and we have to feel nice, and we have to make sure that we are healthy and full of vitality and strength in order that the body assists the soul in serving God. So those are some of the beautiful laws that we learn out from this week's parsha. And I think it also helps us to see that the Torah is very beautifully balanced. There's a place for everything. When we are trying to serve God, one of the best ways we can do it when engaging with the physical is through intention. I'm sitting here and I'm drinking. I need to say a bracha, which is, it takes a few seconds. Why would somebody not make the effort to do so? I need to say a bracha, and my intention needs to be to elevate this physical entity in the world. If I'm going out to buy something, let me buy a dress that makes me look like that I'm representing the Jewish nation like a princess. And my intention should be that I want to wear it in order to give Hashem nachas. These are the ways that we should go forward in the world, engaging with physicality and looking after and supporting the body. But we shouldn't let physicality and the pursuit of physicality be all-consuming. And that is often the test, specifically, I think, of today, of our days. Okay, we have such a little bit of time. I'm sorry if I tend to go over time a little bit. I want to bring a story of a righteous woman who is known as Gittel, and I'll try and keep it short. What I can do is post it to the Wednesday group and to anybody else who wants it so that you can get the full story, because it's really a moving story. Many years ago, at the time of the Maggid of Mezrich, who was the Baal Shem Tov's successor, his son was a very righteous and holy man, and he was called Avraham HaMalach, Avraham the angel, because of his righteousness. And he was about 24, 25 years old. He'd been married for 10 years, and then sadly his wife passed away. And so after a time, actually, Avraham HaMalach did not desire to remarry because he was very happy to consume himself completely with spirituality. But his father said no, it was necessary that he should remarry. And his father, who was a complete tzaddik, sent two of his disciples to go to another town, to the home of a young 12-year-old girl, and request from her parents that she be married to this young man, Avraham HaMalach. Okay, so they went to the home. The mother was concerned. Her daughter's very young. Who is this family? She accompanied her to the home of the Maggid of Mezrich and his son. And everywhere she went, she was actually welcomed with enormous prestige and enormous honor, because she's going to consider a marriage with a very, very righteous person. And so her mother agreed to the marriage. They drew up the marriage contract, and then her mother left, understanding that she had found a good husband to be married to. And what happened was, as time passed, this young woman who ran the home found favor in her father-in-law's eyes, in the eyes of this great tzaddik, the Maggid of Mezrich. And one night she had a dream. She fell asleep, and in her dream, she saw that she was standing before a sparkling palace. And when she entered, there was a beis din that was sitting. And they said that the time for her husband's life had now ended. And she argued with them, and then she woke up. And obviously she was distressed, but she didn't share it with anybody. Unfortunately, she dreamt that same dream 3 nights in a row. Now, we know if a person has the exact same dream 3 nights in a row, it's not considered nonsense. It's not something to be dismissed. And in the 3rd dream, she actually argued very strongly for the sake of her husband's life and why he should be permitted to have his years extended. And the beis din turned to her and told her, "You have done well. Your husband's life has indeed been extended." I can't remember how many more years he got. Perhaps it was 12 or 15 years. And when she woke up, her father-in-law actually came to her and said, "You have done extremely well, and you have been granted, it's in your merit that your husband has been granted many more years to live." And as time passed, this woman's father-in-law would appear to her in dreams and communicate to her in dreams. And one time when her husband went he moved to another town, and then he called for his wife to come, pack up everything, and join him there once he had settled himself. And the night before she was supposed to go, her father-in-law appeared to her in a dream and said, "Don't move there. Don't pack up everything. Don't go." And she listened to her father-in-law's counsel, because he had already passed away. And the next day, the time was up and her husband passed away. And so luckily she hadn't moved her entire life and gone to a strange town to settle. This young woman's name was Gittel. And the Shabbos after her husband passed away, she journeyed to the town where he was nifta, where he had passed away, to be at the funeral. And so she spent the Shabbos there. And that Shabbos they tried to host her, the townspeople, and to comfort her, but to no avail. She was so devastated and heartbroken. And at the Seudat Shlishit, the 3rd meal on Shabbat afternoon, she sat on a couch and she was completely heartbroken. And they began to sing beautiful melodies, beautiful songs to bring out Shabbat. And she fell asleep while they were singing these very lofty tunes. And she had a dream, and her husband appeared to her in a dream at this glittering palace. And he said to her as follows. He said, "I want to ask the heavenly court to forgive me. I had a very good and beautiful wife, and I was not always present as a husband. I was very much involved in learning Torah and in my service to God." And she said, "I forgive you with a full heart." She loved him dearly. And then he said, if my wife desires, she's still young, she may remarry. But if she chooses not to, I promise that she and our sons will be well looked after for the rest of her life. And when she woke up, she was comforted and she felt much more joy. And in fact, her sons were brought up in the home of Reb Shlomo of Karlin, who was a very great tzaddik. And one of the sons married one of his daughters, and another son ended up marrying the granddaughter of Reb Menachem Nachum. Oh, I can't remember his name, a great tzaddik from Chernobyl. And after a time, this tzaddik's wife passed away. And so he thought that this woman, Gittel, who was clearly a very righteous woman, would probably be a good wife for him. And we know that in the Torah law, that a person should not stay widowed for long, that after time, they're encouraged to remarry. And so this tzaddik asked his new grandson, who had married his granddaughter, if he would approach his mother and ask if she would agree to the match. And so the son was on his way to go and ask his mother if she would agree to the match to this very righteous man. And on the way, he stopped over somewhere. He fell asleep and he had a dream. And in the dream, he saw his father, who had died when he was a young boy, who was Reb Avraham Hamalach, this Gittel's husband, the only husband she had married. And he was standing outside a glittering palace. And he was holding up, or he was standing by the doorway and his arms were on the rooftop. And he was crying and he said, somebody is trying to enter into my palace. And so this young boy realized that his mother was not supposed to remarry. Clearly, there had been an incredibly strong connection between her and her late husband. And so he did not pursue this shidduch, this match. And so she never remarried, and she spent the end of her days in the Holy Land, fulfilling a lifelong dream of going and settling in Eretz Israel. This is a very moving story of clearly a young woman who was very righteous and recognized for her righteousness by a great tzaddik of the time, the Maggid of Mezrich. And we see that we too, as women, are told that we have the opportunity to reach the greatest level of righteousness. And if it is the Hebrew maidservant that represents the highest level in our service and in our divine pursuits, in our spiritual pursuits in this world, then we need to understand our power as women. As women, we can reach the highest heights. And please God, we are told that it is through us, the righteous women of our generation, that ultimately we will experience Geula and we will have Mashiach. Thanks, ladies. Thanks for joining me this morning. So lovely to see everybody. Hello, everybody, especially those whose cameras are on. So nice to see you. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope